My name is Ellis. I'm happy to be with you today. So I'm going to start a series of tutorials. So this is tutorial 1 for me. And so today we're going to talk about the Vinyasa. So the intention behind these tutorials is to give you a little bit of refinement, maybe on some things that are familiar, to introduce why we do any of these things that we do in yoga, and also to offer various options so that this can work in your body. So let's talk about what the Vinyasa is, and then I'll show you some examples, and then I'll show you some different versions, and so you can curate this to fit you. Okay, so to start, we hear this word Vinyasa used in a couple of different ways in yoga. First is it's used to describe a style of yoga, so you might go to a Vinyasa class, and that typically means a class that is flowy, maybe a little bit fast-paced, not always, but it's flowy, it's rhythmic, there's probably a bit of repetition, but that would be sort of your kind of what you have in your mind is like a typical flow type class, as opposed to like a hatha class where it's just like go to this pose, go to that pose. So that's one thing. The second definition of Vinyasa, and the one that we're going to be working with today, is what I like to call the chorus of a Vinyasa style class, of a flow class. And so that is that series of postures that you do sort of between each side. So you might do the right side of a flow, high lunge, warrior 2, peaceful warrior, and then bring the hands down, step back, and your teacher might say, Vinyasa. And you say, okay, I don't know what that is. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, that sort of chorus, the thing that you do between sides. To break it down even further, the word Vinyasa in Sanskrit literally means to place with attention, to move with attention. Another translation of it might be to move with breath. And so if we look at it that way, then Vinyasa doesn't have to fit into this little box of chaturanga, upward facing dog. It can be a variety of different things as long as it feels like you are moving with attention and with an intention to pay attention. And as long as we are moving with our breath. And so think of the Vinyasa as having a few purposes in our practice. It builds heat, so it warms up the body. Repetition is an important part of a Vinyasa class because repetition helps us settle our attention. If we can repeat something several times, then our minds don't have to be working so hard to think about what's coming next. Instead, we can really drop into that sort of flow state, into that mindful state. And then it also just sort of links our different movements. So that's enough talking. That's what the Vinyasa is. And so my hope by the end of this tutorial is that when you go to a flow class and the teacher says, okay, Vinyasa, you can say, oh, I've got this whole arsenal of ideas. I've got this whole framework I can use to approach the Vinyasa, and therefore I can customize it to suit my body. And it doesn't have to be just a static, this is how my body always is. But it might be, I've been traveling a lot for work, I'm really exhausted, I'm going to take this version of a Vinyasa that to me feels more grounded. Or I am on fire today, I feel strong and graceful and beautiful and whatever, and so I'm going to take it up a notch. And so we're going to build some tools that can help you customize this for you. So let's get started with sort of the two, what I'd call sort of traditional, what you'll typically see taught as a Vinyasa. We'll do some modifications of those, and then we'll talk about some other options. All right. So Vinyasa, sort of number 1 that we're going to talk about, includes basically 2 different poses. And it's important to note that typically our Vinyasas, where they fit in our flow, is that it'll be after maybe a standing sequence, so after, say, warriors or lunges, and then you'll step down and step to plank. And then usually the end point where we all meet at the end of a Vinyasa is downward facing dog. So your teacher might say, All right, move through a vinyasa. We'll meet in downward facing dog. The number of times I've said that is countless. Sometimes home base might be tabletop, hands and knees, so we'll talk about that. Anyway, so our first vinyasa kind of traditional version is a plank and cobra pose. And so we move through that by lowering from a high plank all the way down to the belly, and we try to do that in one solid piece. And then we lift our hearts in cobra pose. So in cobra pose, our legs are grounded, tops of the feet are pressing down, our pelvis is grounded, and what's lifting is the heart and the head. So this is what this might look like. So you might, be in a lunge. Teacher says, okay, cartwheel your hands down, step back to plank, move through a vinyasa. So let's talk about plank pose first. In plank pose, we've got our hands right underneath our shoulders. So wrists are underneath the shoulders. I'm pressing through the pads of the hand, so I'm not just resting on the ankles or on the wrists. Those are your hand ankles, by the way, your wrists. I'm pressing through the finger pads. Now, my belly is hugging in, legs are strong. So they're not just hanging out, belly isn't sagging, belly's hugging in, legs are strong. This is your high plank. And then we'll lower all the way down to the belly. So depending on your body, you might shift forward on the toes. You might not. For me, I shift forward on the toes, elbows squeeze against the ribs, lower all the way down to the belly. Next in our vinyasa is cobra pose. We untuck the toes, press into the tops of the feet, and notice how my kneecaps lift. And then my pubic bone wraps down towards the ground so that my tailbone points towards my heels. Hands stay more or less where they landed when you lowered. Squeeze the elbows to the ribs, loop the shoulders into the ears, and then lift the heart up. And in this variation, we're using the back to lift the heart. So my hands aren't really doing anything. They're just stabilizing. So this would be your inhale. And then your exhale would lower. And then you'd press up through plank. So from here on the belly, this is a challenging one. I'm going to tuck my toes under, firm the legs, kneecaps lift. Firm the legs even more, thighs lift. Firm the belly, pelvis lift. Squeeze the elbows to the ribs, press up, and then downward facing dog. So at full speed, it's plank, lower on your exhale, cobra as you breathe in, lower as you breathe out, push up, downward facing dog. Okay, so that's vinyasa option number one. Plank all the way to your belly, cobra. So let's talk about some ways that we can adjust that to fit our bodies. So that lowering from high plank to plank with control can be challenging. So here's two ways that we can adjust that if you're still working on upper body strength. And so what I'm going to show you are ways that we can, we're going to call it regress the shape. And then you can work in that version for a while, building the strength up, and then you'll be able to do your full plank lower. So two options. One that we see oftentimes is rather than coming from plank and lowering, we come from knee plank. And what I encourage you to do is when the teacher cues plank, take plank. And this is going to help you build strength. And then when it's time to lower, drop the knees down and see how my body is still in a straight line, knees to shoulders. Squeeze the elbows to the ribs, lower down. And then we've got cobra again. Now the push up, also real hard. So if you can't push up into a high plank, what I don't want you to do is just peel yourself up, right? That's not giving us an opportunity to build strength, and I want us to get strong. So if you can't push up all the way, you're going to push up through knee plank. Squeeze the elbows, hug the belly in, push up, and then to come to downward facing dog, lengthen the legs, tuck the toes. Okay? So in full speed, that version is plank, knee plank, lower. Lift the heart. Lower. Firm the belly, knee plank to press up, downward facing dog. All right, so that's one option. Another option, this is sort of a weird one. This one is good if your wrists bug you a bit, but this can require a fair amount of upper body strength. So I like this version for a few reasons. So high plank with your hands on blocks takes some of the load off of the wrists, off of the hands, and brings it to your legs. But what that means when you lower is that you're actually doing what we in strength training call a deficit push-up. That's a great way to build strength, but you might not be there yet. If you are, cool, this is a really good way to get strong. You're gonna be sure the blocks are wide enough and then lower your chest right between. You'll scoot the blocks to the side, lift your heart, lower down. You can press up through your knee plank, or if you're like, I want to get my shoulders hella strong, and you can do this with integrity, you're going to do deficit push-up. Squeeze the elbows, tuck the toes, push up. See, we increase the range of motion. Downward facing dog. Okay, so that's option one. Ways we can customize that other than coming to our knees like I showed you is to do a different belly down back bend. So, we're always doing a belly down back bend, always in a vinyasa, so cobra, up dog, whatever. From this version where we lower all the way down to our bellies, you could do sphinx pose, seal pose, locust pose, and there's a number of variations of locust. And so to do that, we'll do our same lowering down. If we want sphinx pose, which this is a good one if you're just feeling a little tired, you're gonna bring the elbows underneath your shoulders and the forearms make a number 11. And then we're not just hanging out, okay? Press into your feet, light up the legs. And then I want you to press into your forearms so that the shoulders don't shrug up into the ear. So here's sphinx pose. Okay, then we can turn sphinx pose or take another version called seal pose. And this one is a really powerful back strengthener. So starting in sphinx, you're going to walk the hands wide out to either side. I like to tent the palms. And then I am pressing into the finger pads, really rooting through the legs. And then I'm drawing the chest forward. So you can see if I hug the lats back. Seal pose. All right. And then the last version that you might try is a locust pose. So there's a lot of different versions of locust. You can interlace the hands behind your back. Lift the heart. You might lift the legs. You could also take the arms wide. You could take the arms forward. You could take them behind your skull. This is a really great upper back strengthener. And you can see how these all work in that framework of lowering down to the belly and moving through cobra. Okay, so that's sort of family of shapes number one. High plank, lower to the belly, and you can do it through knee plank. And then sort of for drawing a flow chart, you can choose cobra, you can choose locust pose, seal pose, sphinx pose. You can do a wide cobra, tent the palms wide, pressing the hands a little more. So that's family number one. Family number two is chaturanga. And so this is one that requires a fair amount of upper body strength. And so if you're still working on the upper body strength, what I would rather you do is do cobra with so much integrity. And that way you're going to build a ton of strength rather than sort of flopping your way through chaturanga and upward facing dog if you cannot perform those with integrity. And it's not really an issue of injury, it's an issue of optimizing your ability to build strength. So if we are moving through chaturanga without integrity, and by that I mean without keeping the body in a straight line, without doing all of these things that we use to engage the musculature, if we're just sort of trying to make the outward shape, we're missing out on opportunity to build strength. So anyway, family number one, plank all the way down at the belly, various belly down back bends. Family number two, high plank to low plank, which is chaturanga dandasana. And then it's upward facing dog, Urdhva Mukha Svanasana. People confuse these two, cobra and up dog. Upward facing dog, the only things touching the ground are the tips of your toes and your hands. Your legs are lifted, belly, pelvis is lifted. It's a deeper back bend than cobra, and it requires a ton of muscular engagement. And sometimes we see people just sort of flopping their way through these things, and I want us to slow it down a bit. So I'm going to show it to you all the way through, and then we're going to talk about some specifics. So same thing, same starting point, plank pose. Chaturanga is a halfway lower, so till our elbows are about at 90 degrees. So the body weight shifts forward on the toes, elbows squeeze to the ribs, lower halfway, and then untuck the toes, lift the heart up. Urdhva Mukha Svanasana. So notice thighs are lifted, everything's engaged, and I press into the hands so that the shoulders are out of the ears. And then from here to downward facing dog. All right. So a few things. I'll just show you. In chaturanga, elbows squeeze to the ribs. We're lowered about halfway. People who fearmonger about shoulders shouldn't go past the elbows. It's not based in anatomy. So you're going to find the variation that feels good in your body and feels stable. For me, my shoulders actually do dip a little bit past the elbows, and it feels good in my body. You might not quite go to 90. It doesn't matter from an injury perspective. It's just adapting to that range of motion. So we shift forward, lower halfway, and then keeping myself lowered halfway, I untuck the toes, and then it's like a push-up. Press into the hands, lift the heart. Okay, upward facing dog. In general, we're looking at untucked toes, and then I'm not just sagging into the low back, I'm engaging the legs, pressing into the hands. And then that transition to downward facing dog, I use the low belly to hinge at the hips. And then some people can roll over their toes. I can't quite do that. I've got an old foot injury. It doesn't let me do that. So I just step my toes under. Okay. So let's talk about ways that we can modify that shape. And it's challenging. So you can do knee down. You can lower all the way to the belly and then come up from the ground to upward facing dog. So when we're going from chaturanga to up dog, we're building it top down. We can build it from bottom up. So that would be, if you can't achieve a chaturanga push-up with integrity, you're going to do this knee down push-up like we did before. Press into the feet. And then you might have to shift the hands a little back. You're going to have to feel this out in your body. Press into the feet. Lift the heart. Lift the legs. And then if you can't hinge at the hips, you'll bring the knees down, come to tabletop, and then downward facing dog. Okay, so there's not a ton of ways to level down that chaturanga to upward facing dog. That's one. Let's talk about leveling it up. So if you're feeling on fire, or if you're feeling like, I really want to take this opportunity to build a lot of strength, we're going to do a couple different versions that do that. One is that you just get to add push-ups, and I'll show you a way you can add push-ups at the beginning or at the end. Obviously, push-ups have been around for millennia. They're a really great way to get strong in the upper body, the chest, the arms, the upper back. And then the other way is we can go from high plank straight into upward facing dog, and this is a really fun way to challenge our attention, and it requires a ton of stability in the core, in the back. And then finally, we'll talk about a three-legged vinyasa. So, all right, so then talking about push-ups, you can always go from high plank to low plank and do a few push-ups before you transition to upward facing dog. What I like to do is from upward facing dog, go into chaturanga. So I pop the toes under, and then I can do some push-ups. So again, that looks like upward facing dog. Watch my legs, they stay lifted, pop the toes. Then I can do some push-ups. And then downward facing dog. Okay, So that's option one, to level up at push-ups beginning or the end. I love the hopping the toes under transition. So going from high plank, low plank, upward facing dog, back to low plank, push-ups, downward facing dog. It's like my favorite variation. That also feels good because sometimes my back's tired from like lifting, not from yoga, and that transition of up dog and down dog stresses those same muscles. Sometimes it's a little tiring for me. That's option one. Option two is going straight from high plank into upward facing dog. I love this variation. And for this one, you end up in a toes tucked upward facing dog. And there are some people who are going to say that you shouldn't do toes tucked upward facing dog, and those people don't understand how the body works. It is perfectly safe to do upward facing dog with your toes tucked. There's nothing in our anatomy that says we can't back bend with our feet in plantar flexion. And so we'll do that. And it just really involves very strong legs. So from high plank, keeping the toes tucked, I want you to think about bringing the chest forward. So not bringing the hips low, but bringing the chest forward. Pressing into the hands, firm legs. Then I can come up to downward facing dog. Okay? So again, we'd roll forward to plank, and just keep that rolling energy forward. Chest reaches forward, shoulder blades wrap together. So that's that option. Last option is our three-legged vinyasa. And so you'll see people in your classes doing that. They're very fancy. And that will often come if you're coming from a lunge. So, teacher says, cartwheel your hands down to a lunge, vinyasa, and you're like, okay, this is my chance. This front foot is going to be lifted behind me when I step back to plank. So I'll be in a three-legged plank. For these purposes, your hands, your arms are also legs. So hand reaches back, or hand reaches down, foot reaches back. And then I keep the same integrity, lower halfway. And then you can either bring both feet down to lift up, or keep the leg lifted the whole time. Lower halfway. You can make it a little fancy, a little back bend, and then downward facing dog. Okay, so that gets us through the sort of traditional ones, and then here's where it's open-ended for you. Remember that vinyasa means to place with attention, and it doesn't need to be any of these things. It can be exactly what you want. A really great option is just doing cat and cow, dropping the belly as you breathe in, doming the spine as you breathe out. That is a perfect, beautiful vinyasa. I do that in my practice energetically. So, I am very strong, is the fact, but I don't always need to go 100%, and I shouldn't either. Sometimes I need to take it down a notch. And so cat and cow is a great option. Other options for vinyasas, sometimes I'll do, a lunge with a back bend, because that just, my body's like, yeah, that's good. Your vinyasa can be resting in child's pose. And then the placing with attention is your breath. So if you're in a fast-paced class and you're feeling out of breath, you don't need to, push yourself over the edge by, doing 1,600 chaturanga push-ups just because some lady on YouTube told you to do that. You can instead take a pause in child's pose and just breathe. You can take a pause in downward facing dog. These are also great, I'm going to call it like emotional modifications. So really, this yoga practice is obviously, it's in part physical, but it is really an opportunity to listen a little bit deeper to what our bodies are asking for, and to the state of our being. And so we curate this, our daily practice, our whatever practice, to suit our bodies exactly as they show up day to day. So sometimes your shoulders are tired. Sometimes you feel overwhelmed and hurried. All kinds of things. And so you're going to modify, and modify isn't a bad word. Modify is just making a different choice to suit your body. Okay, So I think that's everything for what I wanted to cover for the Vinyasa today. There are other versions. There's Vinyasa in a chair. I think I'm going to do a chair yoga little tutorial on here to show you some options. There's also hands-free Vinyasas standing. Okay, I'm not going to show you that today because I think you can figure it out. What would it look like to do cobra standing? Try it out. You can, so you know, sometimes if you are pregnant, it can be hard to do this up and down. If you've got vertigo, if your wrists are just bugging you, there's no reason why we need to do planks. So you can do standing Vinyasa, you can do Vinyasa at the wall, you can do Vinyasa in a chair. And so we're going to cover that in another video, I think. But that's it for me today. I really appreciate you prioritizing this practice for studying a little bit deeper. Please let me know in the comments or find me on Instagram and shoot me a message with any questions, any things that you would like to be covered in a future video, and I'll be glad to accommodate you. All right, thanks so much.